In this exercise, we're going to use CSS to create a grid layout, and this is what our file will end up looking like. So you can see I have kind of a grid layout of information. I've gone ahead and made a responsive page, so at a certain point when my page gets smaller, the grid layout is going to change. And this kind of is more reminiscent of a table type layout, but this is not using any tabular data. We're just going to do this all using CSS. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me show you the HTML that I've created. The HTML is fairly straightforward. I have an article tag that wraps around everything on my page. I have an H1 and a paragraph tag, which start off as the kind of introduction of the content on the page. I have a section tag that wraps around the rest of the content on the page. And within that section tag, I have a div tag that is going to contain two child divs. And the two child divs are going to contain H2s with paragraphs. And that is set up that's set up the same way. So I actually have three of these kind of wrapper divs, if you will, and then they each contain two child divs that have the content. The CSS that I've created so far looks like this. So I'm importing some Google fonts on the body tag. I'm setting my background to an image. I'm setting the overall font family. On the article tag, I have some margin settings. Notice that I am using a 35% on the left, and that is so that when the page is resized, you can kind of see the turtle here on the left. So that's creating that space for the actual turtle. And currently, if I refresh my page, this is what the page looks like. So we haven't actually completed all the rest of the formatting. The page currently looks like this. All right, on my section tag, I have a border, and I'm setting the background color to a 40% white. On the H1s, I just have some basic formatting that is going to set the font and the size and color and whatnot. The H2, I have some similar types of formatting there. I have a rule in my paragraph that sets the spacing on the margin on the bottom to 16 pixels. I'm setting my A tag colors just to a light blue, and on the section paragraphs, so this is going to exclude the paragraph that's up here, but on my section paragraphs, I've resized the font size down to 0.9 ems, and then I'm adjusting some of the other settings, and you can see them right here. And then I have an empty media query, which we'll use later so that we can turn this into a responsive page. So let's go about tackling this file and turning it into a grid type layout. The first thing that I'm going to do on my file is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set the section tag to have a display of table. So by itself, this actually doesn't do anything. If we go and check this in the browser and refresh, you can see that nothing has actually changed on my page. I'm just rearranging my layout so we can kind of see what happens as we make the changes. So needless to say, I've changed the display to table. What we're going to do next is we're going to start by making some new rules. So down here, before my media query ends, I'm going to make a new selector, and this is going to be for section greater than div. This is going to only target the first three divs within that section, which are the divs we use to group the first and second, the third and fourth, and the fifth and sixth sub divs. So when I use section greater than div, what we're going to be getting is we're going to be getting those divs that wrap around. So I'm going to get this div that wraps around. I'm going to get the second div that wraps around the blocks, which are 3 and 4, and then the third div which wraps around the blocks, which are 5 and 6. So this is only getting the divs that are direct descendants of the section tag. We're going to tell these to text align center, and we're going to tell these to display as table rows. So if I save and we refresh, all that's going to happen is we're going to see the center aligned text occurring. We don't actually see anything else that is going to change on our page yet, but it will once we write a little bit more CSS. The next rule that I'm going to make is going to be for section, and then I'm going to use the greater than div. So this is going to get those sub grandchild divs, if you will. And we are going to tell these divs to display as table cells, and we're going to assign them to have a width of 50%. We're going to give them some padding, and the padding that we're going to use is going to be 15 pixels. And I'm going to assign a border left, and we'll make the border left solid, 1 pixel, and white. And then I'm going to actually do that same thing again, but I'm going to assign a border on the bottom. So again, I'm going to use solid, 1 pixel, and we'll use FFF, which is white. So if I save now and we refresh in the browser, you can see what I've done is I've actually turned these into table cells, and now I get kind of like a 2-column layout. And if I resize my page, this is going to grow and shrink based on the size of my page. So that's looking a little bit better. That's kind of more in lines of what I'd like it to look like. This just obviously is going to get too narrow at some point because we haven't done anything with our media query, but we'll do that in just a minute. There are a couple of things that we want to address. If you look at the stroke or the border on our pseudo table that we're making, you can see on the left hand side and on the bottom it's slightly thicker than the rest, and that's because we've assigned the border on the left and the bottom and it's doubling up. So we're going to need to eliminate that from happening, and we'll use a pseudo class selector to do that. So my next selector is going to be section greater than, and we're going to do div, and then we're going to get the nested child divs, but we're going to only get the first child. So I'm going to isolate these to be real specific and only get the first child. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a border left rule and set that to none. This is going to eliminate that doubled up border. So if I save now, when I refresh, you'll see that the border on the left is going to be eliminated. So now that's a single stroke. So I need to do the same thing on the bottom. I'll just copy this rule right here and I'll paste this in, and I'm going to change my selector to be section, and this time I'm going to do div colon last child. So I want to get the last child, the very bottom kind of wrapper div, if you will, the last. So this is the third wrapper div, and I want to get its children, and I'm going to tell the border on the bottom to be none here. So when I refresh, you'll see that the border on the bottom is going to be eliminated, and now it's just 1 pixel as well. So that's looking pretty good. Now we have our full-size screen working in the way that we want. The thing that we're going to fix next is when the page gets narrow, this doesn't really look readable, so we want to eliminate the 2 columns at the smaller size. So we'll do that by adding these rules into our media query. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to make some rules on my section tag. On the section tag, I'm going to set my border bottom to none. I'm going to set my background color, and we're just going to set the background color to be RGBA, which I am using up above. So if we go look here on the section tag, you can see that I'm setting the background color to be an RGBA of 40%. We're going to go ahead and we're going to use that same declaration, but we'll change it to be 60%. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I have more going on in this left-hand pane of my image. When the image is wider, it still is pretty readable to read all of the text on this kind of blue and green background. But when my image gets more narrow and the turtle starts to come into play, it's a little more difficult. So we're just going to make this be 60%. So if I refresh now, you can see how that's just a little bit less transparent, a little bit more opaque, which helps with the readability. We do need to kind of restyle our link color because the link color at this point starts to be a little bit light. So I'll make a rule on my links, and I'm simply going to set the color to something that is not quite so light. So I'll just kind of get a darker shade of the blue that I'm using, so this will show up a little bit better. The next thing that I want to do is I want to prevent the section divs from displaying as table rows. So we'll go ahead and use a section greater than div, and I'm going to tell those to display as they do by default, which is just inline. So if I save now and we refresh in the browser, you can see that we still haven't made a total change, because all we're doing right now is telling the display to not be table row. But remember, that didn't do anything by itself, but I need to kind of turn that off so that we can then control the children items. So now we're going to make a selector that is going to be section greater than div space div. So now we're getting those little children divs that we have that are nested within the divs. And I'm going to set my width to inherit. This is going to override the 50% setting that we set earlier. So this is going to prevent the width from being 50% and just set it back to what it would normally be by default. We're going to change our display to be block. I'm going to tell my border left to be none. And we're going to set the text align back to left. So if we come back in here and refresh, you can see that now we go to one column. That looks pretty good. There is a problem at the very bottom two divs that we're dealing with. We need to have the separator between this and at the very bottom one as well. So to add those two underlines back in, we're going to make a new selector. This one is going to be section greater than div, and we're going to use our pseudo class of last child, and then we're going to use div. So this is only going to get the third wrapper div and then its children div. So this would be 5 and 6, which are Olive Ridley and our Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. I'm going to set the border on the bottom to be solid, 1 pixel in white, and if we refresh now, we can see that we get the underlines on those last two settings as well. So now we've built a kind of grid layout. It is responsive, and we haven't used any sort of tabular data. We've done this all with CSS, so our page is optimized in that way.